Hey everybody, it's FoxeoGames, and how are all of you doing? If this releases as planned, it should be Christmas Day 2016, at least for those that live in the United States. Alrighty, so Final Fantasy 15, a long time coming. I believe it's been about a decade in the making. It has changed quite a lot since it was first conceived. It began as an entry in the Final Fantasy 13 series, and thank goodness they broke away from that. I think a lot of us can agree that 13, while you may or may not have liked some of the entries in that series, you have to admit that a lot of people had a lot of problems with it, and for arguably good reason. But we're not here to talk about 13, we're here to talk about Final Fantasy 15 on the PlayStation 4, also available on the Xbox One. A rumor of a PC version possibly coming out in the next year is out there, but no confirmations at this time. People are experiencing some crashing issues. I did have the game crash on me one time, and I also had problems with the camera getting stuck and being unable to move for some reason. I'm not sure why. I ended up having to actually quit out of the game and lose progress when that happened. But other than that happening with one crash and one camera problem, I haven't experienced any other significant technical issues. As for the graphics, well, they maintain a fairly consistent 30 frames per second most of the time, which is pretty impressive considering how expansive and reasonably detailed the view distance in this game is. It is very impressive given that it's running on a PlayStation 4. I didn't get a chance to play the Xbox One version, although looking at videos on the internet and what other people have said, it does appear very clear that the PS4 version is superior in many ways, particularly in the resolution. Now, the problem that we do run into is that in order to avoid the shimmering effect of aliasing, which is jagged edges on lines, they've implemented a type of AA, anti-aliasing, that causes the entire image to be significantly blurred. I will say though that I think it's a good trade-off. I mean, I don't like the shimmering that happens in a lot of games with that much aliasing. However, the anti-aliasing in this case does cause a significant blur, which some people won't like. This is going to be up to taste, but overall, I think they made the right call here. To get into a little bit of detail, there is some nice volumetric lighting in dark areas, as well as lighting sources that light areas differently depending on what angle you're looking at. They cast realistic shadows. However, some of the shadows in the game do kind of pop in right in front of you as you're driving and whatnot. But usually if you're just running around and closed in areas, it looks actually really, really good for a console game. Of course, I'm talking mainly about the PlayStation 4 version, no personal experience with the Xbox One version. As always, you will have to put up with me being primarily a PC gamer, so a lot of the compliments I'll give to the game and a lot of the criticisms I'll make towards the game will be based on the fact that I'm primarily a PC gamer and I know what really, really good looking games can look like and can play like. So ultimately, as a big PC gamer, I'm just not as easily impressed by the mostly lackluster graphics of console titles, and that's for good reason. It's because, by comparison, they're just not that great, so I'm just not going to be blown away by anything on consoles. I may be impressed by what they're able to accomplish, but the PC versions of those games, if they exist, would accomplish much more, much better, and with a much smoother frame rate most of the time. Well, I do want to say that the day-night cycles are also pretty good with the complementary lighting. I mean, it does look nice when the sun is setting or rising, although I will say that it was frustrating that at night these tough enemies would pop up and basically make it impossible for you to enjoy running around in the darkness in the overworld, unless you just level up your characters a ton, which I didn't bother doing. Overall, I will say this, though, that for the most part, the textures did not stand out as being particularly low resolution or bad, which is good. That's usually a sacrifice made in games like this. And as mentioned before, the view distance in certain areas when the game is actually open world, well, for the most part, is really impressive for a console title. I was kind of blown away. It reminded me a bit of Xenoblade Chronicles X, and Xenoblade Chronicles X was even more impressive given that it was on the far weaker Wii U. Character and enemy models are significantly detailed in the game, and that's impressive considering how many can appear at times. I mean, there will be situations where you'll be surrounded by a dozen or more enemies, and there's not a significant drop in frame rate. There is some, but not as big as you might expect. So, well done there. This is obviously a finely tuned game in many ways. It's well optimized, on the PlayStation 4 at least. As for the sound, music, and voice, well, the music is actually quite good, ranging from decent background tracks to some awesome music that you could add to your playlists. However, I will say that I hated the inclusion of one particular rendition of a popular song that you might have actually heard on the radio. I think it's called Lean On Me or something like that. But all I'm going to say is that it really broke the immersion for me. I didn't like it. I don't really like the original song. I don't like the rendition in this game. And I feel like it didn't really belong in a Final Fantasy. The game features context-sensitive music changes, as would be expected in most open-world games, because, hey, you're just going to be running around and suddenly go from adventuring quietly in a forest to, boom, some enemies have popped up, so you do kind of need that context-sensitive music. You do conduct combat right there wherever the enemies pop up, so again, you know, you're not switching to a separate battle arena where a battle music would start, for example. Some of the songs have clearly nostalgic touches added to them. You'll recognize them from previous Final Fantasies. They're not direct ripoffs, but they may have some riffs or melodies that are familiar to long-term fans of the series. I will say, though, that while the Chocobo song is okay, I'm not a big fan of it, one time, this is obviously a technical issue I didn't mention earlier, but one time it just kicked in randomly for no reason. I just came out of a cave. There were no chocobos around. No one was talking about chocobos. There was nothing to do with chocobos at the moment. But then suddenly, the chocobo song started playing so loud, I couldn't hear anything else in the game. I think it was definitely a bug because there was no reason for it to happen. It never happened again, and I'm still confused as to why it happened. As for the voice acting, it's all either good or really excellent. I don't think there are any cases where I thought the voice acting was bad, which is good. I mean, the most you can expect from most video games when it comes to voice acting is that nothing in it sounds bad. That's kind of the standard there. Does anything sound bad in the game? No? Okay, well then it's good. But while I will say it's good for what it is, I did not appreciate Cindy's overbearing Southern American accent. I thought they went way too far with that one, and given that she's the only character in the game with that accent, I mean, from a lore perspective, I don't know if it made any sense if they ever explained where she was from and why she had such an overbearing accent, while nobody else in the game had an accent remotely similar to hers. On the subject of voice acting, I will have to say that the lip syncing is really bad. It is way off. I mean, just mouths are flapping and sounds are coming out, and there doesn't seem to be any connection between the two. I will say that for the most part, when the mouth stops moving, the dialogue stops, but I mean, there almost seems no connection between them. It's just like the mouth is moving, there's some dialogue. When we move to the subject of story, well, I will say this, I hated the fact that when you started out in the game, I think the developers expected that you would have already watched the Kingsglaive movie. I didn't, I don't want to, I don't feel like I should have to watch an entire movie separate outside of the game to know what's going on, but if you don't, you're going to be really lost a lot of the times. I didn't know who a lot of the characters were in the game, like characters will come and go, and it was clear from the way the story played out that I was supposed to care or at least know who they were, that they were supposed to have some significance. But I couldn't even really tell like who they were, what they were connected to, why they came into the story, why they died, what the significance of any of that was. And yet here these characters were clearly trying to indicate to me this is significant, but I don't know why. And there are so many characters that you barely even meet, and then suddenly they're gone. That's it, they're gone. Like they have significant amount of effort put into their character design. That's very clear. They have very detailed outfits. The voice actors are really good. They introduce themselves in a way that seems significant. And then, poof. After that moment, they're gone forever. Never see them again. Or if you do see them again, it's insignificant. And on the subject of story, I don't think they did enough with some of the settings in the game. There's this really big city that you visit in the game, and it looks significant. It's huge, it's well detailed, there's so much to it, and yet you only do really one significant thing there. I mean, there are like two dialogue scenes that play out, one significant event, I'll say, I don't want to ruin anything, and then it's over. It's done, and as far as I know, there's no way to return to it unless you make use of this element in the game where you can sort of like time travel. It's really clear that they didn't know how to do an open world properly. We'll get more to that later, because they included the dog, I think, whose name is like Umbra, and there's this dog that you can summon and talk to, and you can like teleport time travel back to a different point in the game. And that's the only way they could think of to actually bring the open world aspect back after they basically got rid of it. But on the subject of open world, let's get to the gameplay. We'll start with the combat. It's unique to the series. It's not terrible. It's not amazing. I will say that it's a refreshing change from Final Fantasy 13 that basically took this very hands-off approach where you spent most of the time watching and not really playing very much, just giving these generic inputs and stuff would happen. In Final Fantasy 15, it's by default an active time-based system, although you can switch it to wait time-based system, and there's even a skill tree to build into the wait mode for combat. I did not take advantage of the wait mode for combat at all, so I can't comment on it. I know I probably should have, but I didn't. So it was all real time for me, which I think is the way they designed the game to be played. A lot of people have told me to go ahead and switch over to wait because it's better. I would have to say that in hindsight, I think you should probably go with the wait mode because look, as the game dragged on, and we'll get more to this later, I just got endlessly frustrated and agitated by the combat. My characters are just dying left and right. There are 4 party members most of the time. There's you and the 3 others that you see in the advertisements for the game and the trailers. And you can only control Noctis, the main character. The other 3 just kind of do whatever. You can tell them to do a special move at a special time if you've saved up enough points for it, but other than that, they just do whatever they do. And the reason this is really annoying is because some of the magic actually casts an AoE, an area of effect, and it affects your party members. But you can't tell your party members to move. So there's just, you have so little control over the battle, and there's things that happen that damage your own party members that you can do that you can't control. I mean, if they're there, they're there, and if they're not, they're not. You can't tell them to get away. You can't tell them, hey, come over here and stand by me. And that was something that you had in, say, for example, Xenoblade Chronicles and Chronicles X, a game I compare this to for, well, some obvious reasons. If you played both, there are some similarities. Having no control, really no control over your party members is a huge issue when you have friendly fire, area of effect, magic, and whatnot. The real-time combat is, like I said, the default. You essentially hold the circle button to attack. And there's other, inputs to manipulate that further. You have this warping ability where you can warp out and warp in. We'll get more to that later. And you can essentially maneuver around in the open world, and combat occurs right then and there. You have some special skills that seem mostly a waste, like taking photos, fishing. I mean, it's just, honestly, I thought it was stupid. If you're going to take the photos, that's fine, but I don't see why you would ever spend skill points, on photos. Like, you can put skill points so that Prompto, one of your party members, can take more photos. I'm sorry, but that just seems stupid. I mean, if you want to give me points to spend on those basically skills that have little to do with the gameplay, make it a separate skill tree with a separate skill system. That way I'm not wasting points that could be spent on things like combat and techniques and recovery points and all that. And on the topic of skills and all that jazz, let's get to magic, okay? Magic is hugely disappointing. If you think you're going to go into this game and basically run a magic-based character, you're not, because it's extremely limited. You have to absorb magic points from these special draw points, which as far as I know, don't restock. I never saw one restock. And then you craft spells based on lightning, fire, and ice, and an item. It's confusing. I never quite figured out how it's supposed to work. It took me forever to even figure out how to do it, because the interface, to me, was not user-friendly. And the spells have a very limited number of casts. Like, some of them you cast just once, 3 times, 5 times, and it's gone. So essentially, magic is just there for big, major fights. Or if you encounter a bunch of enemies and you're having trouble, you can cast one of your AoE spells. But again, like I mentioned, you're going to hurt your party members with a lot of them. Like, let's say you're standing in water and you decide to cast Blizzara, which is based on Blizzard, or an ice spell. It'll freeze the enemies in place, or the boss possibly. It'll freeze you in place if you're in the water. It'll freeze your party members in place. It'll damage them. And so essentially, magic just felt like a waste. There's so much potential there. And the magic spells, they look so incredible with the particle effects. Some of them are just out of this world cool looking. But then they just frustrate you because they end up hurting you and your party members and restricting your movement or doing this and that. And so their utility is greatly diminished by their extreme limitation and the friendly fire AoE. Let's talk about the controls, because this is one area where I feel like Square Enix really dropped the ball. It's extremely frustrating that several buttons have multiple functions that conflict with each other at times. The biggest example, the interact button, which is also used for picking up stuff or talking to people or interacting with doors or manipulating buttons and levers and all that. It's the same as the jump button. So you'll walk up to pick something up, but if your character just like slightly turns sideways so that the interact option isn't there anymore and you push X on the PlayStation 4 controller, you'll just jump. So you'll be jumping all over the place trying to open a door. Oops, I'm jumping instead of opening the door. Or you might try to rest at a rest point, but as you walk in, you see the prompt. Press X, to stay or rest or whatever it was. But then your character takes one extra step after you let up off the analog stick because your characters had that weird sort of slippery control to them. You press X to rest and boom, you jump. So I was jumping all over the place trying to interact with stuff. It's one of those games where if you just take one step past the point of the interact prompt, you have to back your character up, walk backwards with the analog stick, turn back around and walk forward again to try to reposition yourself. It's just ridiculous. Interact and the jump key should not be the same. Just they shouldn't. I'm jumping all over the place trying to interact with stuff. It's frustrating. Jumping all over, trying to jump on people, just trying to talk to them. We'll get more to some of those later, but the block, parry, and warp prompts are often just way too short in this game. I mean, I miss them way too often. Sometimes I'll see a block prompt pop up, and boom, within a second or two, I'm already hit. You have to hold the block button. Hold it before the attack. You don't press block when the attack hits you. You don't press the block or parry button when the parry prompt appears and you're just about to get hit. No, you have to hold it. This is really confusing, especially as a Souls player. I can't get my mind around the fact that you gotta hit the button and just hold it for a bit before the attack comes. Usually, you hit the button early and hold it, you failed the block or you failed the parry. In this case, you fail the parry if you hit it right as soon as you get hit. Nothing happens. And way too often, I mean, enemies attack so fast. If you attack them and then you see their attack coming, by the time you hit the block button, it's too late. You don't have enough time to hold it to initiate a block. And then blocking drains some of your mana as well, which is just, I don't know, I'm not a fan of that. Now the stamina regeneration, upon letting up, as stamina nears depletion, it sometimes fails. There's a technique you can do where you're running in the game, and you hold the circle button. Oh yeah, I haven't mentioned this yet, guys. The circle button, the attack button, is also the button for running. So when you're trying to run past enemies and you're holding the run and you get too close, Noctis will start auto-attacking because attack and run are the same button. I just don't get what Square Enix was thinking with that. But there's a special thing where you're running. If you get really low on stamina, you let up on the button and push it back, push the button again, you're supposed to regenerate your stamina. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I don't get why. I looked it up. Sometimes it worked for me and sometimes it didn't. Confusing, whatever. Anyway, now if you're trying to run from combat, like I said, you end up getting stuck because you'll be running, and as you're getting close to an enemy, trying to get away from them, Noctis will then turn around and start running towards the enemy to attack them because, like I said, run and attack are the same button, just like pick something up, interact with something, and jump are the same button. Not a fan of that at all. So we've covered the primary bases with the game, but what's my final verdict? Well, I'm just going to say this. I don't like driving segments in games, so I really appreciated the fact that they had Ignis, one of your party members in there, that would auto-drive for you. Although, later on in the game, for a reason, Ignis is no longer available to drive the car. I didn't like this because I essentially had to drive it myself, although there's an auto-skip if you've already driven a segment. The whole driving thing, it wasn't necessary. I don't think they should have ever given you the ability to drive. It's hard to control. There's even a segment where you got to drive through where you're being attacked, and I got stuck up on something one time, and it took me like a good 45 seconds to slowly back it up and try to turn it because it just kept getting caught up on stuff. It's not good. If you're going to have a driving segment in the game, it's got to be good or don't have it at all. That's just my opinion. And, to add insult to injury, even when you set it to auto, if it was your first time through an area, I don't believe you could skip this. You're stuck with this very long segment where you're driving with your buddies, and either one of two things happens. You're all sitting there in silence, which I'm like, okay, so I'd just get up and go do something and wait till it's over. Or number two, which is maybe even worse, your characters are talking. And oftentimes, where this would be a great chance to discuss what's really going on in the world and who the characters are, instead they just sort of babble on stupid stuff, like make stupid jokes or kind of make stupid little insults. And I guess it's supposed to be character development, but to me it wasn't. It was just pointless babbling, and I didn't like it. Most of the time it was a useless conversation, in my opinion. And on the subject of useless conversation, a lot of the dialogue between the characters as you run around, a lot of it's good, but a lot of it's useless. I mean, there are times where Prompto's making dumb comments or other characters are making dumb comments. Later in the game, some of the characters are mad at you for one reason or another, and they keep saying things like, hey, you know, you need to do this, or why don't you think about someone else for a change? And I'm telling you, it gets annoying. It gets annoying really fast. And Prompto, wow, if I could have removed a character from my party, Prompto would have been removed right away. He does not shut up. He's constantly complaining. He's constantly whining. He says the stupidest things. He makes dumb jokes. He makes dumb puns. None of it's funny. None of it's interesting for the most part. He's just annoying. And all you wish is that he would shut up. And there's a point at which Prompto's not in the party for a short period of time, and it is a huge relief, believe me. To be honest, though, I didn't really care for most of the characters, whether they were good characters or bad characters. Most of them seem pretty uninteresting. One of the bad guys is kind of interesting, but, I mean, at the same time, he's a bit cliche. The main characters, I don't think they developed them well enough. They don't really have much happen. I mean, you guys go through the experience together, but I just, you know, I feel like there were a lot of missed opportunities there. And that's one of the big themes for my review of this game is missed opportunity. Now, there are many nice touches, like being able to purchase in-game soundtracks from previous Final Fantasy games and listen to them while you're in the car. But you'll quickly start skipping those car segments if you're like me, so you don't really get to take advantage of it. You can't play these songs during the regular game. You can only play them when you're riding around in the car. You can also buy visual upgrades for the car, but all they do is just change the way it looks, and honestly, I don't care. I skip the car segments as much as possible. When it came to the subject of buying weapons or other things at the store, this is one of those games where most stuff doesn't give you money. Money in the game is gil. You don't seem to get much or any money from regular battles. You're constantly needing money but can't get any. Everything's expensive. Most of the stores in the game sell the same things as the previous stores sold without any upgrade. Once you do find an upgrade, it's like they all have the same upgraded weapons that you can't afford, or at least can't buy many of. And they don't make it clear how it compares to the item you have equipped. I didn't see a direct comparison that most RPGs have. Like, that's really important. But, you know, I mean, there are lots of secrets and items that you can discover through exploration, which is a nice part of the open world, but let's get on to the subject of the open world. While it is in stark contrast to Final Fantasy XIII's long corridors, I will say that it's not actually a really, truly open world game. You start out on what is fairly open world, but they often fall back to their old Final Fantasy XIII ways of narrow corridors and limited spaces. You'll find that more often than not, you're actually being locked into areas where you can't really maneuver around, and there's small rooms, small corridors. Go here, turn back around, go back through the area you've already been, go again. Final Fantasy XIII, you know, is popping up all over the place here. It looks like they wanted to do open world, but just kind of lost their way and was like, let's just go back to the old corridor system. It worked for us. At least they think it did. Also, let's get back on the battle system. I think it lacks a lot of forethought. I want you to look at this situation right here, this video. So as you can see, I don't think they really thought everything through. If you don't give people warp points where they can heal up, or you don't give them a place to like duck and hide where they can heal up and restore, I mean, you get to the point where your health is low, and in this particular case, you can't even attack. There's no attack because you're out of mana. You can't restore it. You're in a small area, so I'm just running around in a circle waiting a long time for it to finally start restoring again. There are lots of side quests, but the vast majority of them are just kill or fetch quests. They're absolutely nothing special. Run here, pick this up, run back, give it to the person. Run here, kill this thing, go back, turn it in. It's busy work. It's basically, it's not much, and it doesn't add anything to the story. None of my experience added much of anything to any of the story. And this was a great chance to build some camaraderie between the party members, or to show what the party members are up to. Have side quests that take you into the party members' personal lives. I didn't see that here. Maybe there were some I missed, because I did start skipping side quests towards the end. But to me, they just seem like busy work to get some money and some experience. Back on the subject of the whole open world thing, there are tons of invisible walls in this game, and they made use of natural terrain and man-made objects to block your path. You'll be running around out in the wild, nowhere near any settlement, and here's a big giant fence. And this fence runs for what seems to be miles. And then when the fence stops, it picks up right up against a mountain. And while there's plenty of space between where the mountain starts and where the fence ends for your character to squeeze through, you can't because it's an invisible wall. It's really clear that they were blocking off segments of the game so that you couldn't get to them. And you're not supposed to really do that a whole lot in an open world. I understand that there'll be certain areas maybe you'll need a key or you'll need to access them later, but they seem to block off the main world of the game in many ways, so it defeats the purpose of it being open world. But on a good note, I did like some of the throwbacks. I don't think they were all done as well as they could have been, but I particularly liked the train segment being a throwback to Final Fantasy VI's train segment, although you didn't. Minor spoiler, you don't actually fight the train itself like you did in Final Fantasy VI. Unfortunately, the train segment, like much of the game, just dragged on way too long and wasn't as interesting as it could have been. But there were other throwbacks as well, mainly in the ways of, enemies and repeated themes. I mean, you had those kind of big guardian, whatever they're called, every game called them something differently, whether it's a Magicite or a guardian or all that, Leviathan, Shiva, Ifrit, and all the others. Biggs and Wedge make an appearance. I'm not going to say how, but they do. There's a Cid in this game. Functions much like the Cid in other games, now with a assistant named Cindy. And there was a little bit of drama surrounding Cindy, but there shouldn't have been. It's not really a big deal. There's also homages to Final Fantasy VI that, there's one big one that I can't mention because it'd be a huge spoiler. Some of you know what I'm talking about. It happens after, I think, Chapter 13. There's a focus on a crystal as being center to the game, and of course that was center to many of the Final Fantasies that were all about crystals or a crystal. And then certain songs, as we mentioned earlier, have riffs or melodies from previous Final Fantasy games. Now, I'd like to do something I haven't done before, or at least haven't done very often, and that is I'd like to start giving some suggestions, some Fox suggestions. Instead of just being critical and pointing out what's wrong, I'd like to point out some things they can do to improve the game. I don't think they'll ever listen to me. I don't think they'll even know that I exist, but I'd like to offer these just so that you guys know I'm not merely offering criticism. I do have some positive suggestions. Number one, and probably one of the biggest, either go full open world or don't. This halfway nonsense does not work. It gives the appearance of open world, but it really isn't. Invisible walls in an open world are highly frustrating because they're extremely restrictive in a way that open world isn't supposed to be. You can't go in the water, so water is basically an invisible wall. You can't get over even tiny fences some of the times. You can't jump from high up. You can't jump from ledges like you could. The best comparison I have, and I've repeated it many times, Xenoblade Chronicles X on the Wii U or Xenoblade Chronicles on the Wii. Play that game. See what actual open world in a JRPG can be, and then come back and play Final Fantasy 15, and you'll see what I mean. There are arbitrary obstructions all over the place. They're painfully obvious. Like I said, fences exist for no reason in the middle of nowhere, clearly just to obstruct your path so that you can't truly explore all of the open world that you would normally be able to explore in an open world game. So that's suggestion one. Number two, the game needs warp points for all battles, or at least the vast majority of them. The game is built around the idea that when Noctis is getting low on health, mana, or both, that he can warp off to some point, hang there, and he can restore his health and mana. There are so many areas in this game that have no warp points whatsoever for long periods of time. I mean, talking sometimes over an hour of just running around and fighting. And essentially, if you get low on health or mana and you don't have any restoratives on hand, you're basically kind of screwed. I mean, you just got to sit there and run around and hope nothing hits you and kills you in the meantime. So it's really critical. Don't take that away during fights, especially in long, drawn-out dungeons, which is exactly what they did. Number three, remove friendly AoE damage. Magic is already so limited, it's virtually useless for the average fight, so why would you make AoE attacks harm your own party members? Please, remove friendly fire for AoE, and get rid of the status effects affecting your party members and yourself as well. That defeats the purpose of using magic, especially when you can't control your characters. Number four, the interact button should not be the same as the jump button. Number 4.5, the run button shouldn't be the same as the attack button. Enough said on those. Number 5, Gil, the game's money, is too hard to come by. Yeah, I know you can do side quests for it, but if you're not going to do side quests, you will basically be running around with the same amount of money, and it won't be changing for long periods of time. And then something happened in the game where it took away a whole bunch of my money, and I found myself unable to buy any of the new gear. And on the topic of gear, we'll get to that in a minute. Number 6, I'd like an option to reduce the party member banter during normal gameplay. They talk too much. Way too much. Not as bad as Dragon's Dogma, but approaching Dragon's Dogma level. Number 7, the game needs more clothing and armor. There's very, very little clothing or armor. In fact, the entire time I went through the game, I think I only had the sets that I began the game with, and then towards the end they give you another set that you have to wear. It's mandatory. Well, at least I'm pretty sure it's mandatory. I didn't try to take it off. Are you able to get other clothing or armor in this game, or do you just have whatever you start with and that's it? Because that was disappointing. That was very disappointing. Number 8, can we stop with these narrow areas where you have to stop all your progress, press X, and then slowly squeeze through some tight little corridor? I mean, can we stop doing that? Yeah, don't do that anymore. Number 9. Distribute the exposition of the story better. This is something they did in 13 as well. Most of the game has very little actually happening. You're just kind of doing ho-hum busy work, and then boom, later portion of the game, they dump all of the exposition on you. It's like, gotta get caught up. This is like an 80-20 kind of thing. 20% of the important exposition happens in the first 80% of the game, and then the last 20% of the game has 80% of the exposition. I mean, that's not an exact number. I'm making that up off the top of my head, but that's what it felt like. And my final suggestion, number 10, you need to really, really shorten the ridiculously long and tedious grind of Chapter 13. It was a laborious grind that was not fun, not interesting, and it's the kind of section that'll make somebody put the game down and never pick it back up. Alright, well, on the final word, hey, remember when I said I'd keep my reviews at around 10 minutes, 15 minutes for big reviews? Well, anyway, that didn't happen, did it? Some games just take too long to talk about. On the final word, is Final Fantasy 15 the Final Fantasy to restore our faith in the series? I mean, a lot of people seem to like it. Can it help us forget about the disaster that was 13, or at least the drama that surrounded 13 with a lot of fans of the series? I will say that it's certainly a lot better than 13 in many, many ways. Although, I mean, again, that's not saying much. 13 didn't set the bar very high. Does 15 reclaim the former glory days of Final Fantasy for a new age, for new players and old players alike? I'm going to have to go with kind of, but not really. I know that is such an equivocating position. I mean, I'm using weasel words here. What do I mean? Well, it's a good game in many ways, but it falls short in most other ways. Like I said, one of the themes of this game is missed opportunity. The combat can be extremely messy, and there's little in the way of weapons and armor compared to previous titles. The story doesn't make much sense if you don't watch the out-of-game movie, so you'll be lost most of the time and not know what's what or who's who and not really get why a moment should be impactful. I'll just say this, there's something at the end where a very important character tells you something, and if you didn't follow along very closely, you wouldn't even know what that meant. I actually learned about it later after I finished the game. And I didn't particularly like any of the characters. I mean, they didn't grow on me. I didn't find them interesting. I thought their outfits looked stupid. I thought some of their hairstyles looked stupid. And, you know, this is not spoiling much. Noctis, the main character, is the king. But, you know, this whole emo king with an anime hairstyle, can we stop doing that, please? I can't connect with that. I really can't. It's just so unrealistic and stupid looking. And I know realism isn't the goal of the game, but even in the context of the game, it looks silly. His father, Noctis' father, actually looks like a real king. I mean, he looks realistic. He looks like a real person would look, like a real king would look. Not like these young, 17-year-old anime dudes that are kings or something. Also, I can't escape the feeling that, just like 13, the devs tried too hard to make the game feel really epic, but didn't put anything behind that to make it as epic as they tried. This is definitely a bigger adventure than 13 in so many ways. Story, setting, combat, all of that. But I think there's a lot of lost opportunity here, and it left me wanting so much more out of this game that the game's never going to be able to offer. As the game dragged on, I came to hate the combat more and more. I just kept dying over and over and over again, and stuff would hit me and knock me on the ground, and I'd get up and get knocked on the ground and get up and get knocked on the ground, and I was using up all of my restoratives and curatives to just stay alive, and perhaps I was under-leveled or didn't know what I was doing, but honestly, something's just terribly wrong. My party members and I just kept dying non-stop, and it frustrated me, and I forced myself to play through probably the last third of the game. It just wasn't very enjoyable, especially 13. So finding it to be a frustrating chore doesn't leave me with a good taste in my mouth. Overall, Final Fantasy 15 to me was a lot of missed opportunities, a lot of improvements, some great ideas, some not so great ideas, and overall it's a giant mixed bag for me. I'm not sure how I feel about it. I think I need some time away from it to come to a final conclusion of whether it's really that great of a game or not. But for me, I definitely had a lot of mixed emotions going through the game. Would I recommend it for you? Well, if you're a huge fan of JRPGs and you want to try something a little different, you can certainly try this, although I wouldn't have paid $60 in hindsight. Definitely not a $60 experience for me. My playthrough took about 40 hours, although I skipped a lot of the side quests towards the end of the game, so you should get a lot more time out of it if you explore more and do more of the side quests, especially things like fishing and all that I found utterly boring. But hey, Final Fantasy 15, this is bound to be another divisive title in the series, just like nearly every title has been since, I would say, about, 8 or 9. What did you guys think of it? Please let me know in the comment section below. You can like or dislike the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and check the video description for all of my social media sites like Twitter, Gab, Minds.com, Facebook, and all that other good stuff. I'm also on Twitch from time to time, so feel free to follow me there. I'm Fox of FoxeoGames, and I'll see you guys next time.